So then we're going to move on to developments. So what I've tried to do here is give both major 2023 developments, but also to update with 2024 where there's something really relevant to make it as useful as possible for those who are with us today. So the first overarching development that I really couldn't ignore when I was putting this together was the Pact on Migration and Asylum. This was proposed in 2020 and it was adopted in 2024. It's often discussed as one piece, but actually it's 11 pieces of legislation, many of which are already in existence and are now being recast, and Ireland is opting into 7 of the 11 pieces of legislation. There is a huge amount, as you can imagine, with such, 11 pieces of EU legislation. But some really important things that are happening there is the introduction of a border procedure, for example, for people who fall into certain categories. And that's kind of instead of the asylum procedure. A solidarity mechanism for refugees that has quite a lot more teeth. So kind of this pay or kind of take refugees idea. Things like contingency plans for reception as a requirement, legally binding timelines for asylum processing, which will be new in Ireland. That is quite literally the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge amount there, and I just picked out a couple that were interesting. What this means for Ireland quite immediately is a redesign of the International Protection Procedure. So, repeal and replacement of the International Protection Act 2015 and extensive changes across the migration, governance framework in Ireland to ensure compliance with this. Now, starting with legal migration, what we saw in 2023 was the largest expansion of the occupations list to date, largely in response to quite broad labour market shortages that we've been seeing for the last few years. That is part of a consultation process, is part of reviewing those lists, and there was a very large number of submissions received, and then a large number of occupations both removed from the ineligible occupations list and put on the critical skills occupations list. We also saw the closure of the immigrant investor program to new applicants. This was a result of increased scrutiny from various bodies and quite a few increased applications in 2023 and 2022, and a review that was done as well by a consultancy firm in collaboration with the Department of Justice that then they decided to close the program. There's a really big update from 2024 here, and that is that the Employment Permits Act was passed in 2024. And if you want a summary of that report, of that act, it's in the 2022 annual report. But there's a huge amount there that changes the legal migration system in Ireland. So things like seasonal employment permits, which will be the first time we have them in Ireland, is, per my understanding, more flexibility, so kind of more in ministerial discretion rather than having to pass legislation for the lists, and the possibility to attach additional requirements to permits. So things like requiring training as a condition of getting a permit, things like that. Of course, the big news in 2023 was in international protection, and of course the pressure on the reception system received a lot of attention and then responses to it. So between January and June and December onwards in 2023, we were unable to accommodate all arrivals. So at the moment, I think that figure stands at around 3,000 people who we aren't able to accommodate. So what happened is that people were assessed for significant vulnerabilities on arrival and kind of triaged as a result. One of the responses was also to increase the daily expense allowance by €75 per week for those who were unaccommodated. Of course, it received extensive media attention. There was a lot of NGO advocacy and research around it, and legal challenges to this as well. So the High Court decision passed in April 2023, based on some cases. I think Emily might go through some of them later. From before the increase of the daily expense allowance, that the response did not come close to what was required by law in terms of human rights protections. There was also then a test case on damages that has been referred to the EU, so basically if people were entitled to damages as a result of these breaches. And the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission also brought proceedings in its own name. My understanding is for the first time since it was established in relation to those challenges. Not all bad news though. So there was actually quite a bit of progress on implementing the white paper on ending direct provision, which has been updated in 2024, but more or less a lot of the principles still stand. So one of these was the introduction of local authority integration teams, which as of 2023 were four-person teams in each of the 31 local authorities, tasked with providing integration supports, largely linking with mainstream services. So making sure that there was information provision and kind of identifying gaps. So really a really important local structure for integration and largely focused on forced migrants. Another thing that we saw, a piece of progress that we saw, was the Health and Information Quality Authority doing its first inspections on permanent international protection centres, as well as funding for children and young people service committees and family support practitioners as, part of this plan to provide more integrated supports to those in the international protection process. We also saw the International Protection Modernisation Programme in the Department of Justice in 2023, and this both basically outlines progress against the Catherine Day recommendations, that was the advisory group on direct provision and the international protection process, and also outlines the Department of Justice's revised approach to address increased applications. So things like increasing staffing in the International Protection Office and bringing in this digital first model in the International Protection Office as well. We also, in kind of other developments, there was a joint committee on children, equality, disability, integration, the youth report on refugees and integration. They kind of held a stakeholder consultation, which is really interesting, and made 96 recommendations across a broad range of topics. One thing that we also saw progress in 2023, which has been further progressed in 2024, is community engagement side of international protection. So of course we saw tensions throughout 2023, which culminated in the riots in November. And a community engagement team was set up in the Department of Children. The Department of Taoiseach also started a communication strategy. So there was kind of these governance structures put in place throughout the year. One, I thought, of the quite interesting ones, it was actually started in 2022, was the Community Recognition Fund. And 50 million euros was made available under this fund in 2023. And basically the idea of this is that it's targeted at communities that are hosting international protection applicants or refugees from Ukraine. And kind of local authorities apply for the funding for community infrastructure that will be used by everyone, and they have to show that there was some kind of local design or consultation in it as well. So I thought that was quite interesting. Quite a few reports and kind of attention around this area as well. So the External Advisory Group, which is linked to the Advisory Group on Direct Provision and the International Protection Service, published a report in 2023 with recommendations and advice, and the Ombudsman for Children also published a report on the safety and welfare of children in direct provision. On temporary protection then, of course, the big news was the extension of the directive that was further extended in 2024 until March 2026 at the moment. There were some major changes in accommodation and supports in 2023. So some of these were related to governance. So there was a memorandum of understanding signed between the several departments and local authorities to identify refurbished property. So a real refurbishment program going on. And we also saw DCD, the Department of Children, funding the Irish Red Cross to take over coordination of the pledged accommodation processes, kind of private hosting arrangements. We also saw the negotiation of new accommodation contracts. So these were kind of moving to a self-catering model more so, and contributions to accommodation, in particular for serviced accommodation where self-catering options weren't available, and a renegotiation of rates. That led to only a loss of around 7.5% of providers. We also then, of course, this got a lot of attention, the changes to the accommodation supports. So a move towards new arrivals getting a maximum accommodation of 90 days and reduced social welfare payments, so more in line with what asylum seekers receive. And that was further changed in 2024 to extend those social welfare changes to all arrivals rather than just new arrivals, so kind of equalising that treatment. And that's for those in kind of serviced accommodation and state accommodation. We also saw the introduction of an absence protocol. So basically that people would lose accommodation if they had been absent for more than 7 days within a 6-month period. And we also saw progress and the expansion of the rapid build programs, this kind of modular housing that is built relatively quickly. We saw the target moving to 700 from 500 and 10 sites completed with a contribution model for rents developed as well. So then very briefly, we have unaccompanied minors and vulnerable groups. We saw the Domestic Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Agency Act 2023 passed. It establishes CUAN, the agency in question, which was opened in 2024. And this is part of the zero tolerance strategy. So this is the Department of Justice strategy against domestic sexual and gender-based violence, which was passed in 2022. We also saw a move to online citizenship applications as part of this kind of overall modernization program in the Department of Justice. And importantly, amendments to the Irish Nationality and Citizenship Act 1956, which had been discussed for quite a while, one of which is to reduce the residence requirements for naturalisation for children born in Ireland. So if a child is born in Ireland, they need to be resident for 3 years rather than 5 years, as was previously. We also saw a clarification on continuous residency, which is the year before the application for citizenship it's required. And previously there was kind of questions around what exactly that meant, and now that's been clarified, and it allows a 70 days absence with an additional 30 days in exceptional circumstances. So it's also a big year for integration. So there was a publication of the National Action Plan Against Racism. And, you know, there's a huge amount in that. There's a summary of it in the report. But governance-wise, it foresees a coordination committee and a special rapporteur who was nominated, I think, appointed in 2024. And also there was some funding behind that as well, with 1.3 million awarded in 2023. As I mentioned again, the local authority integration teams are a really big governance innovation in this area. And we also saw a public consultation on the migrant integration strategy, which expired in 2021. One area that got a lot of attention in 2023 was the hate crime and hate speech legislation. So there was debates on this in the Oireachtas in 2023. And then finally it was passed in October 2024 without the incitement to violence or hatred provision. So there was kind of two separate elements. There was the hate crime element and the hate speech element. There was a lot of controversy around the hate speech element in particular. So the act ended up getting passed with largely focusing on the hate crime elements. So very briefly then, we got our third National Action Plan on trafficking in 2023 as well, which really focuses on a whole of government approach, kind of training frontline providers. And there was governance kind of structures behind that as well. And one of the really big parts of that action plan is the new national referral mechanism for victims of trafficking. And this was published in the Dáil and it passed committee stage in 2023, and it was signed into law in 2024. Basically what this does is kind of broadens who is involved in the identification of victims of trafficking. So as you see, the competent authorities are designated. There's several government departments, also TUSLA, the Child and Family Agency, the Health Service Executive, the Workplace Relations Commission, and An Garda Síochána, plus some NGOs designated as trusted partners for referral of identification of victims of trafficking as well. We also saw the first dedicated accommodation unit for victims of human trafficking set up by the International Protection Accommodation Service with 8 places. And then finally, in irregular migration, visas, borders and return, the major updates were the extension of the visa requirement for recognised refugees from other Council of Europe countries. So this was originally passed in 2022 in response to an increasing number of recognised refugees from other European countries applying for asylum in Ireland. So that was extended again in 2023. We also saw a legal amendment to allow the electronic serving of notices. So this allows notices in relation to immigration to be served by email or portal. And the idea is to make it easier to serve notices, including deportation orders, where somebody cannot be reached by post. We also saw the removal of the option of voluntary return for persons convicted of serious offences, and also a legal amendment to allow for longer voluntary return notice periods for unsuccessful international protection applicants, and that's from 5 to 30 days, and that was one of the Catherine Day report recommendations. Now, that is a huge amount of information in a very short space of time.
It really is. Well done, Ciara. That was really interesting. So we have lots of questions coming in. The first one I'll ask you is, could you tell us a little bit about the Immigrant Investor Programme? What was that, or what is that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So the Immigrant Investor Programme, my understanding is that it was actually brought in the post-crash period. It was kind of a stimulation of the economy and revenue raising idea. And it was basically where someone could make a significant investment in Irish businesses or a significant investment in some kind of non-governmental like charity cause and get residence as a result. So it's been running, I think, since 2015. I'm sure there are very qualified people in our audience who will correct me if I'm wrong, but that was my understanding of it.
Great, thank you. And then turning to temporary protection, we have a two-part question. Do we know what the impact will be on temporary protection if the war ends before 2026? And the second part is, do we know if residence is reckonable for naturalisation here in Ireland?
So I think that the question of whether it's reckonable for residency has not been resolved, is my understanding. Some colleagues who are also on the call can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding, that we're awaiting clarification on that question. And the first question is what the impact will be on temporary protection if the war ends. So my understanding is that will be a Council of Europe decision on how to deal with that. I'm not an expert in the temporary protection processes, but my understanding is that would be a Council of Europe decision.
Thanks, Ciara. And maybe just one quick one. Could you tell us a little bit about the occupation lists? How does that system work?
Absolutely, yeah. So basically how we manage the kind of labour market and ensure that the idea is to ensure that there's not too much competition from non-EU migration on the labour market. So for Irish and EU nationals, the idea is essentially that we manage it through two lists. We have the ineligible occupation list, which lists occupations that are not eligible for any employment permit. So basically we say there's sufficient labour in Ireland and the EU for those occupations, so they're not eligible at all. If something is not on that list, basically anything not on that list is eligible for a general employment permit. So we have two separate types of employment permit with two separate kind of criteria, but also rights essentially attached to them. We then have the critical skills occupations list, and this basically says these are skills that we really want to attract into Ireland. We need them for the economy or for XYZ reason. There's various reasons I think something can be designated a critical skill. And this basically means you can skip, for example, the labour market's needs test. So to get a general employment permit, an employer has to advertise a job and show that it hasn't been filled by Irish or EU nationals. And there's more advantageous conditions attached to the critical skills employment permit as well. It's very brief.
Thanks, Ciara. That's great. And we should probably move on to the next section. Just to remind people, the answers to lots of their questions are in the report. So do have a look there also if we don't get back to you.